Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Thursday. Welcome to our June 2023 webinar. This is Madison Slater. I'm the EVP of Security and Operations here at JSCM Group. And as we've been doing all year, welcome to our security-focused webinar. This month, we're going to be talking about strengthening your data backup and recovery. We're going to talk about how we can get our data backups to work with us when it comes to our bigger cybersecurity picture. So throughout the year, again, we've been doing a different topic each month. We have been building up to a couple of different ideas over the course of the year. This month, in talking about our data backups, we're continuing on this journey of cybersecurity. And as we move throughout the year, we're getting closer and closer to talking about the bigger picture, which is incident response. So part of this month's conversation with data backups, I know backups themselves are maybe not the most exciting thing to talk about, but I do think that this is a very important topic when it comes to our overall security. So I want to start with our question, as we always do, to really get this kicked off and to get us in the right mindset, which is, if you had a security incident today, if your organization had some type of security incident, are you confident that you would be able to recover your data through your backups? Now, this question can often be met with a lot of anxiety, especially if the answer is, I hope so. One of the things that we find when we're talking about data backups is that this is sometimes an area that people don't necessarily feel super confident about. So we're going to talk about the importance of this, but also some methods that we can use and some concepts that we can use in order to get ourselves to a point where we can answer that question more confidently. Now, I want to take it back a little bit to IT 101. This is something that we have known for a long time. We need data backups. When you are stepping foot into the IT realm and you're starting to take over some piece of IT for an organization, we often see that this is something that we are just presented with, and it's sort of become this common concept that you need to have data backups. But the problem is that because that has become such a common thought, I do think that over time, it means that we stop paying attention, which is why sometimes when we get asked that question, or if we were to get asked the question, do you think you could recover your data from your backups, we might have a little bit of anxiety with our response. We start assuming that the data would be there if we needed it. But unfortunately, in a lot of situations, what we are finding is that it's not actually there the way that we thought it was. So anyone that's attended these webinars in the past knows that I love to tell stories. I love to share our experiences. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about when it comes to data backups was some of our experiences, specifically with the security incidents that we've dealt with over the years. In the course of 2022, we had several major security incidents that we were working with. We had a bunch of smaller scale security incidents, email compromises, things like that. But we had several very large scale security incidents where we had several organizations that were hit with ransomware. What happened in every single one of those was that we were finding that they suffered in some way from insufficient backups. In one situation, they had data backups for the majority of their material, for the majority of their files and information, but they had one particular system that was actually very critical to their environment that the backups failed, and they could not recover those. In another situation, we had a client that had data backups running. When it came time to restore from those data backups, it took them at least a week to even get access into the system because it had never been properly maintained. The data was sort of there, but they still were also not able to recover completely either. In another situation, we found that they were running backups on some systems, but not all. So what we find when we're talking about backups is that we see from our position and from our perspective when it comes to incident response that more often than not, the backups are not there to support the organization in the time that they are needed. Why is this a problem? Well, when we're talking about things like a major compromise, like ransomware, backups really are your saving grace. That's the best way for you to get back to where you were, is to be able to restore a successful backup. If you don't have that, then what you're looking at is rebuilding completely. Now, in general, our perspective when we're dealing with a situation that we've had a ransomware or major event, we typically do want to start over in as many ways as possible. However, that doesn't mean that we want all of our users to have to recreate all of their files. It doesn't mean that we want to have to rebuild at that level. We're typically talking about rebuilding from a structural perspective. So even if we are approaching it from what we call the scorched earth perspective, which is start over, you still need to have backups in order to recover the actual details of your work. Now, depending on the type of organization that you're in, you could have a bunch of different backups that you have running, but it ultimately depends on making sure that that data is maintained, that that is something that you can rely on. And why is this an issue? Why is this something that we see pop up? Why is it that we more often than not in these situations have seen that organizations were not able to successfully restore when they should have? The problem is that we're not taking into consideration our changes in our environment. What happens in a lot of situations is that years in the past, we put into place some type of backup structure. But what happens is that over the course of time, our environment changes. So the way that it was structured 10 years ago, the way that it was structured 5 years ago, even 2 years ago is not the same even as it is today. So if at some point in the past we implemented that backup process and the backup structure, but we haven't reevaluated since then, it means that we could be left in a situation where we are not able to recover if we need to. Backups are there for worst case scenario. We shouldn't have to restore our backups every day. But because they're there for worst case scenario, we absolutely need to make sure that they are reliable. So if we are not regularly reevaluating our environment, it means that we could be missing something. I want each of you to think right now about your organization, about the data backups that you are running. And I want you to think about the last time you actually sat and looked at what you are backing up. If it has been even more than a year ago, it's time for you to reevaluate your environment. It should be something that we are regularly reviewing, but it should also be something that we start building in from a process perspective anytime we're going to be making a major change in our environment. If you're going through a process where you are restructuring so that you're relying on an AWS or an Azure environment, you're putting more in the cloud, you need to take into consideration, you need to take stock of what your backup structure looks like to ensure that it can uphold you in the event there were a situation. If that's not something that you've done, this is the perfect time. I always use summers because around here they can be a little bit more quiet as a way for me to go back through and review all of that. Let me make sure all of my ducks are in a row. Let me make sure that I've got everything set the way that I need to. Let me make sure that I haven't missed anything over the course of the past year that really should be included in my backup strategy. Part of this is really taking into consideration your crown jewels. And if that's not a concept that you're familiar with, think of it from the perspective of the things that your organization needs most, the things that you need to protect more than anything else, the things that if it were a crown jewel, if it were an actual piece of jewelry or a high-end piece of art or something like that, you would put in a glass box with lasers all around it. Those are the types of things that are our crown jewels. So again, depending on the organization, that could be very different. If you're in healthcare, that could be patient records. If you're in education, that could be student information. If you're just a run-of-the-mill organization as you see yourself, that could just be employee data. But you need to take into consideration what your crown jewels are, and you need to make sure that your backup strategy is built in such a way that it is protecting that. Now, I will say around here, I don't really take into consideration backing up individual user computers. That's not my main concern. I am backing up where our core data lives. I am backing up the areas where that is stored. Now, talking about files and things like that and talking about data, one of the other things that we often run into is a misconception of what we actually do need to be backing up. And one of the biggest things that I have seen over the years is this misunderstanding of what it means to have cloud hosted pieces of our environment. This has become a little bit more clear over the last couple of years, but when we first started really getting involved with 365, when we ourselves started using it, when we started noticing a lot more of our clients moving to 365, it was honestly really alarming the amounts of conversations that I was having where I would ask how they were managing their backups for their 365, and they would say, "Oh, no, I'm just relying on Microsoft's backups." Or I would ask, what about your AWS environment or your Azure environment? How are you making sure that's backed up? Oh, no, no, it's taken care of. Moving things to the cloud does not necessarily take the responsibility off of us. There is a misconception that often happens with these larger cloud providers that they are backing up our data, and that's not correct. They're not backing up our data. They have redundancy in their environment so that our data is not completely lost in the event that one of their servers crashed, but they are not running backups in the way that we think about them. One of the best examples I can give of that is 365. So if you are a 365 environment, as we are, you probably use quite a bit when it comes to SharePoint/Teams and OneDrive. We made the move several years ago where we don't really have a file server in-house any longer. We store all of our documents in the 365 environment. I have taken it off of my network from that perspective. So my network is not responsible for backing up that data, but I still am as the controller of our environment and the controller and protector of our data. Putting it in 365 did not take me off the hook. If something were to happen in our environment, I still need the ability to make sure that that data can be recovered. If you think about a situation like ransomware, so what typically happens in those situations is that ransomware spreads throughout the environment and it's going to lock files that it finds. Now that can include OneDrive and SharePoint files if they are mirrored or shared down to an individual device. So like on my laptop, my OneDrive files are synced through my File Explorer. If my computer were to get compromised, that data can get encrypted. What do I do if that happens? I have to be able to recover it. Now, yes, there are certain things like revision histories and things like that that I can pull through the 365 capabilities, but that's not really a full backup. So I had to make sure as we started making that move that I was implementing a type of backup outside of just whatever basic functionality 365 allowed. And there are plenty of tools out there that will allow you to do that. We use Barracuda Cloud to Cloud for our 365 backups, and it's great because it runs every day. It runs a backup of our email environments or the Exchange portion of 365, our SharePoint, our Teams, our individual user OneDrives. It backs it all up, which is part of why I don't worry about individual user computers. If someone's computer around here crashed, as long as they were storing their data in OneDrive, which they are directed to do as part of our company policy, and which we help them with by setting that up when we set up the computer, I don't have to worry about that PC. Throw it out, get another one, put it in, they sign into 365, and they've got their files. By having that data backup, I can make sure that in the event we had a security incident, I can go in and pull that information. Even just accidentally deleting things. This happened to me last week. I was looking for a file from about 7 or 8 months ago that at some point, as I'm sure many of you do, I felt like I needed to clean up my files and I thought, oh no, that's not one I need. Turns out I did. I didn't have that in my files any longer. It was outside of the time in which I could have gone back in and pulled it through 365. Where did I get it? From our backup solution. I was able to recover it very quickly. It was a very small scale disaster for at least me personally, but my backup solution allowed me to do that. If you are using something like Azure, or if you are using something like AWS to host pieces of your environment, you need to make sure that those are being backed up as well. We have virtual domain controllers that we have running in AWS. I have those set to back up because I can't rely on AWS to restore that data for me. Again, they're building redundancy into their environments, but there's nothing that is guaranteeing that my data is protected in the event something bad were to happen, and especially in the event of something like a compromise. So just because we're moving things to the cloud, we can't look at that from the perspective of taking that off of our plate, taking that off of our list of responsibilities. If it is our data, if it is our organization's data, regardless of where it is hosted, we have to make sure that there are proper processes in place for the protection of that data. Now, talking about data and talking about the things that we're backing up, again, even if you are using something like 365 and you have taken measures to implement some other type of backup solution, that's still not all of it. The other misconception that I often see is that we really just need to focus on our files. But the reality is that we have a lot more pieces of our organization that we need to make sure that we are backing up. Now, we might not back them up at the same frequency as we would a file. So, we back up our 365 environment, some of it daily, some of it weekly. We don't necessarily have to have that level of focus with every piece of data in our organization, but we do need to make sure that we're taking into consideration the other areas that could be directly impacted. So things like Active Directory, that's usually a pretty straightforward one. Hopefully you've got some type of backup that's running that can restore your AD environment in the event you had something bad happen. That's a very common thing. That's usually one that we see people have put focus on. Good. You don't want to have to rebuild that from scratch. User documents is also another one that we often see a lot of focus on, making sure that users could restore their files, whether those are hosted on premise or whether those are cloud managed, making sure that we have some type of process there. There's typically a lot of focus on user documents. Now, where we start to often get outside of what people are focusing on are things like firewall configurations. So I specifically point out firewalls. Yes, I'm a firewall person, so I think about it a lot, but I also think about it from the perspective of what does my network depend on? Now, we've taken a lot of steps around here at JSCM, as I am sure your organization probably has because of what happened in 2020, where we have tried to lessen our dependency on our physical environment as much as possible. It's why we have more things running in the cloud. But there is still some type of dependency here on my physical office. We do have users that are set up to work here, not necessarily remotely. What makes my network operate? Well, the firewall is a big part of that. So when you're thinking about your backup strategy, it shouldn't just be focused around your data. It should be focused around the devices or the pieces of your environment that are helping make sure that data can be accessed or processed. So ensuring that we're doing things like regular backups of our firewall configurations is really important because I promise you do not want to have to rebuild that from scratch if something were to happen. If that device gets corrupted, if you have a physical disaster, if for some reason it wasn't plugged into a something that would protect against, a power surge, if you don't have a battery backup, anything like that, the worst can happen. So we need to make sure that we are taking at least semi-regular backups of things like our firewall. Also, things like our switches. Again, anything inside of our organization that could be relied upon or that is deeply relied upon for access. We need to make sure that we're taking those backups. The purpose of a backup is to get us back up and running as quickly as possible. If we are having to rebuild things from scratch, that just increases that time exponentially. So we have to also make sure that we're thinking outside of our IT 101, back up your AD and back up your documents. We have to take into consideration the other pieces of that to make sure that we have a fully functioning strategy in place. So How do we go about this? Because again, a lot of our conversations this year have been talking about not just why we need to do something, but how do we actually implement it? So, in order to effectively implement good data backup processes or a good data backup strategy, you need to have good data backup processes and procedures. So, setting yourself up for success is really important when it comes to setting expectations of how these data backups are going to be managed. So when you're thinking about data backups, and again, with the conversations we've been having this year, you need to make sure that you have a good data backup policy that is specifying what your organization's expectations are for that process. What do we include in a backup policy? Because it shouldn't just say we're backing up data. It needs to go into a little bit more detail, right? So the first thing that we need to be specifying is what data are we backing up? And this is going back to what we were just talking about with reevaluating that. Our policy needs to specify what we consider to be that mission critical information that we want to make sure we can restore at a moment's notice. So if that is our AD infrastructure, if that is our file system, if that is configurations for network devices, if that is our SharePoint or AWS or anything like that, we need to first identify what do we need to make sure we can restore. Again, here, I don't really care about local files that you stored on your computer because you should be storing that in OneDrive. So for me, I'm looking at that high level where I am backing up SharePoint and OneDrive. But every organization is going to be different. If you have an on-premise EMR system, and that's something that your organization relies on very heavily, it better be backed up. If you have some type of fundamental application that you're running for your organization, you better make sure that that's being backed up. The other thing that we need to take into consideration is what systems, multiple, are being used to store backups. Because what we should also know is that we can't just rely on one thing. We can't put all of our eggs in one basket because that means that we are just setting ourselves up for failure. So we need to understand what systems we are using to store those backups. So if that is maybe a combination of something on-premise and cloud, maybe it is a couple of different cloud backups, maybe it's sort of all of those included. So here our backup process is that I sort of have a mix. I have an on-premise device that does backups. It also replicates immediately to the cloud. I have backups running in our AWS environment for those systems. Those systems are also set up to back up to our on-premise backup. I have another system that is backing up our 365. I have another thing that I am using to store backups for our firewall. We have to make sure that we are thinking about that full picture, and honestly, incorporating more than one type of backup is very beneficial. In the event it fails, you've got redundancy. At the very least, I have always recommended if you are going to run an on-premise backup solution, it should have cloud synchronization. If it does not, you need to replace it. You need to be looking at something that can give you some type of secondary or offsite data. If we are just relying on one system and that system fails, then it doesn't really do us any good. The other thing we need to take into consideration, how often are we backing up? And again, this could be dependent on the data that we're talking about. So some data we might say that is mission critical, that changes a lot, I need to back that up daily. Other information we can say, it doesn't really change that much, I just need to have a once a week or even once a month backup. But we need to have that outlined related to the data that we are backing up so that there are expectations on how often that data backup is going to occur. Doesn't all have to be the same. We have to take into consideration again what those crown jewels are, how often changes might be made, and then make the best judgment for our own environments. And again, are we using on-site backups? Are we using off-site backups? Are we making sure that we've got a combination of both? We need to make sure that we are taking everything, all of these pieces, and thinking them through to ensure that we're not ending up in a situation where we can't recover. If you are in a situation where your backup strategy has not changed in a couple of years, I strongly recommend that you take that and reevaluate. I am never someone who is afraid to replace something, even if I really like it, but it's not doing what it should. Backup systems are in that list for me. If my backup solution is not doing what it's supposed to, I need to look for something that will do the thing that I need it to do, that will make sure that data is there when I need to pull it out. Now, all of this is just setting the expectations for our backups. It's just saying, here's what we're going to be doing. But the final piece of any good backup strategy, of any good backup policy, is that we have to make sure we are testing our backups. If you do not test your backups, how do you know that the data will be there when you need it? Because it says that it will be, because you got an alert saying backup successful, I can tell you that is not good enough. It might be, it might have been successful, but what if you weren't backing up the right information? So sure, I can restore that file, but it turns out I missed this whole other structure in my backups that I'm really going to need. A good backup process will also incorporate regular testing. Now, testing backups is another area that there are a million different ways to do it. It ultimately comes down to your organization and how you can ensure that data is there when you need it. At a bare minimum, if you are in a position where you can't really spin up a secondary environment to do a full recovery, I get it. Honestly, most organizations are that way. Most organizations cannot swallow the costs of a backup testing environment. So start with something. One of the things that I very regularly do, one of the things we have in our backup process, is that I will go into our different backup systems and I will just find random files. And I will find them that are buried deep in a subfolder that's in another subfolder that's in another subfolder that's in another subfolder. The deeper I go, if I can recover that, that to me says, okay, my backup is able to pull that level of detail and I can recover it and make sure that the file is valid, that it's not corrupt, that I can act on it if I need to. But we need to make sure that we are testing those backups. Otherwise, we're running on blind faith, which I can tell you, again, in all the situations that we've worked in over the last couple of years, that blind faith usually gets us in hot water. It usually means that we are not actually able to recover the way that we thought we could. So if you feel like your backup environment is good, if you've maybe recently replaced it or you've recently reviewed the data that you're backing up, make sure that the second piece of that is that you are actually testing it. We have to get out of the mindset of assumption. If I can go in and restore a file from my backup, when you ask me the question, if I had a security incident tomorrow, do I feel confident that I could restore my backups, restore my data? My answer is yes. Yes, I test it. I test it regularly. I regularly review what we are backing up. So I feel pretty confident that we would be okay. But with that confidence also comes the understanding that I can't get back into the assumptive mindset. I can't go back to the idea of, oh yeah, it's fine. So we have to make sure that we're continuing to look at that. As always, we don't want to just leave you with a lot of ideas about backups. We do want to give you something actionable. So we do have a data backup and recovery template. If your organization does not currently have a data backup policy, or if you are just wanting to expand on that a little bit, we have created a starting point. Again, backups, it's really particular to your organization as far as what your data is and where it's stored, but this will at least set the baseline of setting expectations for that data backup and making sure that we are taking steps to ensure that it's tested effectively. This is a great time of year if your organization is like ours and you start noticing, because lots of people are on vacation, and it can be a little easier to check off some of those things on your to-do list. This should absolutely be something that you are checking off. We have to make sure that our backups are there, that we can recover, because I guarantee you do not want to feel that anxiety, that stress, that pressure when you are in worst case scenario and you're not able to recover. As we continue throughout the year, our focus, of course, is on helping your organization make improvements. We're using a lot of the experiences that we've had here internally, but also in dealing with the clients that we deal with, and in seeing the things that they've gone through, both from the incident response side and also just from our general assessment and testing side, to help you make improvements. Next month, we will continue on to our 12-part webinar series. This now marks us officially halfway through 2023. In July, we're going to be talking about data encryption. So definitely some good information there if you are an organization that is particularly concerned about data. We all have it. That's the secret. Make sure that you tune in with us in July. If you happen to have missed out on any of our previous webinars and would like to go back and review any of those, they are posted on our website. And as always, if you ever have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We are always here to help. We are always here to answer those questions if you do happen to have them. So thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate you joining in this month. I hope that hopefully all of you that are in attendance have some fun vacations planned, but we also look forward to speaking with you next month when we talk about encryption. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your week.